Right now, in a yard on the Texas coast, there is a pile of cut steel that used to be the USS Kitty Hawk, an aircraft carrier 1,000 feet long that tens of thousands of Americans served on. The United States Navy sold the Kitty Hawk for 1 cent, not 1 million, not $1, 1 cent, and the buyer was not getting a bargain. Most people know the Kitty Hawk as the last conventionally powered aircraft carrier the Navy ever ran. Almost nobody knows what happened between the day she was decommissioned and the day she was cut up. And that is the part that still makes veterans angry 13 years later. There was a group that raised $5 million to save her. There was a final voyage of 16,000 miles, under tow, around the bottom of South America because she was too wide for the Panama Canal. There is a reason the Navy said no that has nothing to do with money. And there is a second carrier that went the same way for the same price, in the same year. By the end of this video, you will know exactly why a ship that size ends up sold for a penny, what the veterans were told, and where the last pieces of her are today. Before we keep going, thank you for being here. I want to ask you something, and I ask it genuinely. Where in the world are you watching this from? And did you serve aboard the Kitty Hawk, or did somebody in your family? If you did, tell me the years and tell me the deployment, because those are the comments I read first. Start with what she was, because the price only makes sense afterwards. The Kitty Hawk was commissioned on the 29th of April, 1961. Over 1,000 feet long, 80-odd thousand tons, 4 steam catapults, oil-fired boilers, and a crew that with the air wing embarked ran to something over 5,000 people. She was the lead ship of her class, and she was, by the end, the last carrier in the fleet that burned fuel oil instead of splitting atoms. Her class was an incremental improvement on the preceding Forrestal-class supercarriers. 7 months after Kitty Hawk entered service, the Navy commissioned the USS Enterprise, the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, and the fuel oil era began its end. She spent almost half a century in service. Vietnam, over and over. She was on the line for some of the heaviest air operations of the war. In 1984, in the Sea of Japan, she collided at night with a submerged Soviet submarine that had been shadowing the battle group. The submarine came off worse. From 1998, she was forward deployed to Japan, home-ported at Yokosuka, which meant that for 10 years, she was the carrier that America kept permanently parked in the Western Pacific. She was decommissioned on the 12th of May, 2009, and towed to the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard at Bremerton in Washington State to sit with the rest of the inactive fleet. And she did sit for 12 years. That is what most people know. Here is the part they do not. Being tied up in Bremerton is not the end of the story for a ship. It is a waiting room, and there are 2 doors out of it. One says museum, the other says scrapyard. To go through the museum door, a ship has to be placed on what the Navy calls donation hold, and then a nonprofit has to satisfy the Naval Sea Systems Command that it can actually do the job. That is not a form. The group has to show a berth, a city, an environmental plan, a business plan, and enough money in hand to prove it can maintain the ship. Not for a year, forever. And here is the figure that decides everything, because it is the one nobody expects. The Battleship New Jersey, which is a museum with a good location, a big audience, and a well-run foundation, cost about $5 million a year just to operate, every year, forever. An aircraft carrier is not a battleship. She is more than 1,000 feet long, with a flight deck the size of several football fields, acres of it, all of it exposed to weather and all of it needing paint. A carrier museum is one of the largest continuous maintenance obligations a private organization can take on in this country. There was a group, the Veterans Association, behind the effort to save the Kitty Hawk raised $5 million, and the Navy said no. I went back and checked that 3 times because when you first hear it, the reaction is that somebody in an office killed the ship out of spite. That is not what happened, and the real answer is worse in a way because there is nobody to be angry at. $5 million is roughly 1 year of running a much smaller museum ship. It is not a berth in a major city. It is not a dredged channel deep enough to take a carrier. It is not the endowment that keeps the flight deck painted in 2040. The requirement is not, can you raise a good amount of money? The requirement is, can you prove this ship will still be maintained long after the people in this room are dead? And then there is the problem that nobody wants to say out loud. So I will. America has already saved its carriers. The Intrepid is in New York. The Yorktown is in Charleston. The Hornet is in Alameda. The Lexington is in Corpus Christi. The Midway is in San Diego. And she's the closest thing to the Kitty Hawk in size and era, and she is one of the most visited museums in the country. A carrier museum works because it is the only carrier museum for 600 miles. Put a second one nearby and both of them fail. The Kitty Hawk did not lose a fight against the Navy. She lost a fight against geography and against the ships that got there first. So the other door opened. In October 2021, the Navy awarded the contract. The Kitty Hawk and the former USS John F. Kennedy, the last two conventionally powered supercarriers America had left, were both sold to International Shipbreaking Limited, a ship recycler in Brownsville, Texas, for 1 cent each. The penny is not a joke, and it is not an insult, although it lands like one. It is how the accounting works. The scrapper is not paying for a ship. He is taking on a job that will cost him tens of millions of dollars in labor, environmental control, and hazardous material handling, and he expects to make his money back out of the steel, the copper, and the aluminium. When the Navy runs the numbers and the scrap value roughly cancels the cost of the work, the price of the ship itself comes out at essentially nothing. A cent is what you write in the box so that the contract is legally a sale. That is the explanation. It does not make anybody feel better, and I do not think it is supposed to. Then came the tow, and this is the part I would have paid to watch from the shore. She left Bremerton on the 15th of January, 2022. She could not go through the Panama Canal. The Kitty Hawk class is far too wide for the locks, and always was. So the shortest route from Washington State to Texas was down the entire west coast of North and South America, through the Strait of Magellan at the bottom of the continent, and back up the Atlantic into the Gulf. 16,000 miles, under tow, on the end of a line with a skeleton crew aboard for the passage and nothing under her own power. It took about 4.5 months. She came into Brownsville at the end of May. People followed her the whole way. Veterans drove to headlands to see her go past. There are photographs of her being pulled through the Magellan Channel, gray and enormous and completely dark, that are some of the strangest naval images of the last 20 years. A ship that had a 5,000-person town aboard it for 50 years, being dragged past the ends of the earth with nobody home. The shipbreakers said structural dismantling would begin that July. Their working figure was around 18 months for the dismantling itself, and estimates for the full process on ships this size run far longer and far more expensive than the public assumes. The industry cost of properly recycling a supercarrier is talked about in the hundreds of millions. And this is the bit that got me when I looked into how the work is actually done. You do not demolish a carrier the way you knock down a building. She stays afloat for a long part of it, moored at the yard, and the work starts at the top and comes down. The mast, the radar, the island. Then the flight deck opened up in sections and lifted off by crane. Before any of that can happen, there are months of stripping, fuel oil residue, asbestos lagging on the steam lines, lead paint, hydraulic fluid, the chemicals of 50 years of running a small city. That is the expensive half, and it produces no steel to sell. Only once she is light enough and low enough does she come up onto the slipway to be cut apart the rest of the way. A ship that displaced over 80,000 tons leaves the yard as tens of thousands of tons of sorted metal on trucks over years. There is a detail from the yard that I have not been able to stop thinking about. When she arrived, sailors came. Men who had served aboard drove to Brownsville to stand at the fence and watch. And some of them had last seen her from a flight deck in 1968. She is not one thing anymore. That is the honest answer to where is the Kitty Hawk now? She is roofing steel and rebar and copper wire and structural beam, sold by weight, distributed across an economy. And if you live in the American South, there is a real chance you have driven over some of her. The Kennedy went to the same yard. So what do I take from it? Here is the thing I keep coming back to. The Navy did not throw the Kitty Hawk away out of carelessness. The people who wanted to save her were not naive. $5 million is a serious amount of money for a veterans organization to raise, and they raised it. Everybody in this story behaved rationally, and the ship still got cut up because the true cost of a preserved carrier is not the purchase. It is the next 50 years of paint, hull surveys, dredging, insurance, and staff, in a country that already has 5 carrier museums and cannot fill a 6th. Every one of those 5 museum ships you can still walk onto today survives because of a decision made in a specific decade by a specific group of people who happen to have a city, a pier, and a plan at the right moment. Not because the ship deserved it more. The Kitty Hawk was the last conventional carrier the United States built and operated. There will never be another one because the Navy does not build them that way anymore. When they cut her up, that entire kind of ship left the world. Not just a hull, a whole way of running a carrier, the boilers, the fuel oil, the smell of it, the men who knew how to nurse those plants through a deployment. That does not go into a museum. It goes into the people who did it, and then it goes with them. So if you served aboard her, put the years in the comments. Right now, that is the only place a lot of this still exists. And if you saw her go past on that last tow, from a headland in Chile, from a beach in Baja, from anywhere, I would really like to know where you were standing.